Captured and at the mercy of an increasingly cruel enemy, German-born U.S. Navy pilot Dieter Dengler was left with no choice but to attempt a daring escape from the Pathet Lao prison camp in which he was being held during the Vietnam War. The fateful decision was made only after he and 6 other POWs had overheard plans to get rid of them as soon as the guards ran out of food. Dieter would choose to take matters into his own hands, deciding that he would be, quote, alive and free or dead. After 23 days on the run through the dense Laos jungle, he was the only one of the group to successfully return to his home country from the camp after the ordeal, making him the first POW airman to escape in the Vietnam War. Pilot Dieter Dengler. Dieter Dengler was born in 1938 in Wildberg, within German Baden-Württemberg. He grew up admiring his maternal grandfather, who had refused to vote for Adolf Hitler. Much of Dengler's admiration came from what his grandfather endured for his principles. His grandfather had been forced to walk around the town with a shaming placard tied to his neck and was subsequently sentenced to hard labor in a mine. In his childhood during the war, Dengler decided he wanted to be a pilot when he saw an Allied fighter from his window, and he settled on pursuing that dream in America after later seeing an Air Force recruitment advertisement in a magazine. When he turned 18, Dengler hitchhiked to Hamburg, where he spent 2 weeks on the streets before his ship departed. He arrived in New York City, where he found an Air Force recruiter who enlisted him under the presumption that he would become a pilot. Instead, after training, he was placed as a potato peeler for 2 whole years. Afterwards, he was allowed to work as a mechanic, where his success led him to the position of gunsmith. While he passed the cadet aviation test, only college graduates were selected at the time, and his enlistment expired. Undeterred, Dengler set about working on obtaining an aeronautics degree from the College of San Mateo, with which he used to enter the U.S. Navy Aviation Cadet Program. Dieter demonstrated his resolve throughout his training. During an escape and survival exercise as part of the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, he managed to escape his mock captivity, and he was the only student to gain weight, as he was willing to eat just about anything. During his inaugural flight, his trainer expressed that vomiting while on the plane would give him a negative mark called a down, of which he could only receive 3 before being dismissed. With the numerous spins and loops, Dieter had no choice but to vomit, which he did into his boot to hide the evidence. After putting it back on, he walked down from the flight without receiving a negative remark. Once he was ready, Dengler was assigned to train as an attack pilot using a Douglas AD Skyraider at the Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. Assigned then to the VA-145 squadron, he was sent on the carrier USS Ranger to Point Yankee, a waypoint off the coast of Vietnam, where carriers and support vessels stood by during the Vietnam War. Capture. The planes aboard the USS Ranger began flying missions over Vietnam on the last day of January in 1966, and on February 1st, Dengler took off from the carrier on a mission against an enemy convoy, never to come back. Thunderstorms interrupted his flight, diverting him to an intersection of the Muagia Pass with poor visibility due to smoke from fires. Dengler lost sight of his 2 companion aircraft, and he was shot down only 2.5 hours into his mission. He would later recall, quote, "It was like lightning striking. The right wing was gone. The airplane seemed to cartwheel through the sky in slow motion. There were more explosions, boom, 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 and I was still able to guide the plane into a clearing in Laos." He was unconscious for minutes, or perhaps an hour, after he ejected from the plane. Once he came back to his senses, he smashed his radio and his equipment so the Vietnamese search parties wouldn't locate it. He spent a day running before troops from the Pathet Lao, a communist political group, apprehended him. He was taken through the jungle by his captors, often subjected to harsh intimidation tactics, such as being tied spread-eagled at night while mosquitoes bit him, being hung upside down with biting ants over him, and being hung over a well at night so he would drown if he fell asleep. He was also dragged by a water buffalo through a village to humiliate him. These tactics were intended to get him to sign an anti-American document, which he repeatedly refused to sign. He would later credit his grandfather for inspiring him to stay strong. Dieter would later recall these difficult days, quote, "They were always thinking of something new to do to me." At the camp. After many difficult days of travel, he was imprisoned at a POW camp close to the Par Kong village, where 3 Thai prisoners were being kept, one of whom, Fizit Interatat, would later be rescued from another camp liberated by the CIA in 1967. An additional 3 prisoners were the Americans Dwayne W. Martin, Eugene de Bruin, and the Chinese national Y.C. To. Dwayne Martin was an Air Force helicopter pilot who had been held for about a year, while the rest of the prisoners were civilian Air America employees who had been held for around 2.5 years. With Dengler joining them, they planned to escape when the monsoon season began so they could easily access fresh water, but after being moved to a camp 10 miles from Hoi Het, it became evident that they would have to escape sooner. With food running out for both prisoners and guards, the prisoners overheard their captors planning to get rid of them in order to go home. Escape. While at the prisoner of war camp, the incarcerated were only fed a handful of rice to share in between the 7 of them during the best of times. They would complement their sustenance by hunting snakes or rats that showed up with sharpened bamboo spears. At night, they would be shackled together to wooden blocks. The hard yet empty time allowed them to memorize the schedules the guards followed. Knowing their time was limited, they planned to escape and signal to a C-130 Hercules that made nightly flights over the area. On June 29th of 1966, 5 months after his capture, the plan was executed. While the guards ate, Dengler opened up the prisoner's enclosure after slipping out of his handcuffs and foot restraints. They took the guards' weapons, which included M1 rifles, a carbine, a submachine gun, a rudimentary AK-47, and some Chinese automatic rifles. Dengler and Martin went first, and took both an M1 and the AK-47, with which he incapacitated 3 of the guards. 2 of the guards ran off, perhaps to get reinforcements, although one of them was wounded. The group figured out their best chance of surviving and avoiding being caught was to split up. The 3 Thai men were to go together along the Chinese National, while the 3 Americans would travel separately. The Thais shared that if they crossed into Thailand, the monks would be elected to grant them refuge. Both groups decided to go west towards Thailand. Unfortunately, Chinese prisoner Y.C. To was in poor physical condition, and the Thai group refused to take him for fear of him slowing them down. American Eugene de Bruin insisted on taking him as part of a third, slower group. Dengler and Martin promised to seek assistance and come back for them. They were never seen again. Martin and Dengler traveled barefoot towards the Mekong River to cross into Thailand, but they never got more than a couple of miles from the prisoner camp. Tribulations of escapees. Going barefoot nearly destroyed their feet, and at one point they found an old sole in the jungle and alternated strapping it with rattan to one of their feet. They managed to arrive at a river, build a makeshift raft, and travel downstream on the dangerous rapids. They were on the cusp of starvation throughout this ordeal, as they had to ration what little rice they had stolen from the camp. At night they would tie their raft to trees, each morning waking up with leeches attached. They eventually discovered that they had traveled in a circle, rather than towards the Mekong. They found an abandoned village where they hid from the rain. A few days later, they built a fire using the powder from one of the carbine cartridges and signaled to a passing C-130 by waving torches in the shape of an SOS. The plane dropped flares in response, and it seemed like they would finally be rescued. No one came back for them. As the days passed, Martin insisted on approaching a village to steal some sustenance as he was suffering from malaria. Although Dengler reportedly tried to convince him not to, they ended up approaching one. A little boy spotted them and brought back a man. The American escapees knelt before him, begging for mercy, but the man instead attacked Martin. Dengler had no choice but to return to the jungle alone. Back at the abandoned village, he signaled another passing C-130, this time by setting all the huts on fire. The plane dropped flares, but the Udom Royal Thai Air Force Base did not recognize the fires as a distress signal from a survivor and decided to ignore their report. Dengler knew he had to do something different to get an aircraft's attention. He took the parachute from one of the flares and kept it for the next time a plane passed by. 23 days since his jungle escape had started, on July 20th, 1966, Eugene Peyton Dietrich from the 1st Air Commando Squadron was flying by on a Skyraider when he noticed the waving flash of white directed at him. Dietrich managed to convince reluctant Air Force leadership to send a rescue party. Finally found by his own people, Dengler was once more put in chains, for fear that he might be a Viet Cong soldier. He explained who he was, but his claims were suspiciously received and ignored by his rescuers as he was transported by helicopter. Survivor. The survivor's identity was finally confirmed at the Da Nang hospital, but the Navy feared that the Air Force would humiliate them by controlling the narrative of his account, rescue, and recovery, so they sent a SEAL team to the hospital to covertly extract him. Dengler was taken out in a covered gurney to the airfield, then flown up to a carrier. He was flown back to the USS Ranger for the first time since he disappeared. A party was thrown in his honor, but Dengler was still in shock, ill, and experiencing night terrors whenever he fell asleep. Due to his malnourished state and poor physical condition, he was flown back to the United States. With the exception of Thai prisoner Phizit Interatat, none of the other escapees were seen again. Dieter Dengler was awarded the Navy Cross and continued to work in the Navy until 1968. He bought a Germanic food restaurant near San Francisco. Traumatized by the hunger he experienced and committed to never reliving that experience, he was known to hide food stashes at his house. Dengler spent his last few working years as an airline pilot after selling his restaurant, and in 1977 returned to Laos, being treated as a celebrity, to confront and find information on the prison that had held him.